Hi, and welcome to this short lecture about pre-code Hollywood. So, what exactly do we mean by pre-code Hollywood? So, pre-code refers to the era of Hollywood films, starting with the widespread adoption of sound in film around 1929 to the enforcement of what is called the Production Code, sometimes called the Hays Code, in July of 1934. So it's this less than 5 year period within Hollywood. However, pre code films are known for openly depicting sex and sexuality, violence, drug use, criminality, profanity, and other themes that would become heavily censored in Hollywood for years afterwards. So in pre code films, you get the images and themes and characters and topics that would be not really allowed in Hollywood film until about the late 60s with the adoption of the rating system. And a lot of these films, too, um, are portraying some of these things in a positive light or not necessarily condemning them, but displaying lots of sex and violence for entertainment and for fun. So, why are there such, dare I say, racy movies in the early 1930s? So, one aspect of the context is the Roaring Twenties, so the decade before the liberalizing and loosening to some extent of morals in the 1920s. So, remember, the 20s was the jazz age. It's the era of the flapper, this sort of young, liberated new woman female figure who cut her hair short and wore like sleeveless dresses and skirts above her knees. Oh my goodness. And went out dancing and partying without chaperones and interacted with members of the opposite sex. And, obviously there are still the lingering effects of Victorian perspectives on morality and relations between men and women, but the 20s is really a time where the younger generations are adopting these sort of more open perspectives about especially female sex and sexuality, as well as just a lot of partying. And even though it's prohibition, a lot of alcohol consumption and listening to jazz music and all of this kind of stuff, which by some older generations was frowned upon. But, you have these people who have been going through this liberalizing of morals in the 20s who are going to the movies in the early 30s. Another aspect of why you get such racy movies in the pre-code era is the Great Depression. So in fall of 1929, you have the stock market crash. It really though takes a year or so for the effect of that to really spread through all of America. But by the early 30s, things are really bad. This is sort of the depths of the Great Depression. I think, that the height of unemployment in 1932, 1933, you had an unemployment rate of 25% in America. And of course, movie attendance started to decline with the economic crisis. A movie ticket costs money. And Hollywood studios were looking for a way to attract audience back to the movie theater. And sex and violence sell. So there is kind of a history of what we would call the production code, or a system of Hollywood attempting to regulate the content of its own films. So one thing to understand in terms of the historical context has nothing to do with movies, but it has to do with baseball. So in 1921, American baseball faced a giant scandal, the Black Sox scandal. I'm not going to talk about it, but you should Google it. It's really interesting. And so baseball, American baseball itself, decided to create the position of commissioner, this sort of independent individual who would make sure that illegal stuff didn't happen. To counter kind of the negative effects of this Black Sox scandal, that's where baseball created the position of commissioner. And other industries started to, especially industries that were facing criticism of corruption or scandal, started emulating this model. And in the early 1920s, actually throughout the entire 1920s, Hollywood faced a number of highly publicized scandals, and these scandals were splashed across every major newspaper in the United States for the decade. Roscoe Arbuckle, who his stage name was Fatty Arbuckle, probably after Charlie Chaplin, the most famous comedic actor in Hollywood at the time. He actually was accused of murdering a actress and model, Virginia Rappe, and went on trial 3 times for her murder. Eventually, he was acquitted, but his career was basically ruined after that, rightly or wrongly. It's a very, very complicated story that still we don't have an answer to today. But he was so famous. And then a lot of theaters decided to ban Arbuckle's movies after this scandal, that it really kind of created Rapé's death occurred sort of at a party in a San Francisco hotel with booze and illicit activities. And so it creates this image of Hollywood as this place of sort of partying and scandal. There's also the murder of director William Desmond Taylor that happened in the 1920s, which is still also unsolved to this day. And there's a lot of interesting theories. Some great books have been written about it. The death of actor Wallace Reid from complications from morphine addiction. The death of flapper actress Olive Thomas. There's a number of other ones I could mention, but there's all of these stories that were hyper sensationalized and often connected to, sex, drugs, partying in early 1920s. And so there's this created this image that it's not just the content of films that can be scandalous, but actually the lives of the people who are in Hollywood are immoral and scandalous. And I mean, the fact that Hollywood was a giant party town in the 20s, yeah, that was kind of true. It just sort of connects to the idea of the Roaring Twenties. So in 1922, in response to some of these scandals, a number of major Hollywood studios got together to create the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA. That's a terrible acronym. And they hired a man by the name of William Hayes to be sort of their commissioner. He was sort of the baseball commissioner, but for film. William Hayes was a former Republican Party chairman and postmaster general under Warren G. Harding. But he was sort of a PR guy. And so the goal of the MPPDA and in hiring Hayes was to clean up the image of the industry. Also, though, to avoid federal regulation of Hollywood. So the MPPDA and William Hayes engaged in this massive PR campaign in the 1920s. They consulted with political and religious groups who were calling for cleaner pictures. They created this official proclamation of don'ts and be carefuls for studio, of things that they shouldn't show and that they should be careful about showing. And they created this in the 1920s, but really it's PR move. It's only lip service. Studios rarely follow these guidelines. They're not enforced. It's just a PR move. In 1930, the MPPDA writes something called the Production Code, the Motion Picture Production Code, what we call the Production Code. It's actually written by a Jesuit priest and a devout Catholic publisher. And so when this production code is written in 1920, technically studios were supposed to submit scripts for a review board, but the review board was really light on their censorship suggestions. And their decisions could be overridden by an appeals board made of studio heads. So even though the production code itself is written in 1930, it's like this previous attempt in 1922. It really just doesn't have any teeth. It's kind of, dead in the water. However, 4 years later, in July of 1934, Hollywood studios made all the major Hollywood studios mutually agree to enforce the production code. So why? Why did this happen in 1934? I mean, there have been all of this, sort of increasing pressure throughout the 20s. This production code is written in 1930, but not really enforced, because clearly you watch the movies from the early 30s, it's not enforced. So why does it get enforced? Why do we get the enforcement of the production code? Sometimes called the Hayes Code, because William Hayes was sort of the head of this organization, although sort of ironic, he actually didn't write it, these other guys wrote it. Why do you get this enforced? So really, by July of 1934, the mounting pressure from a variety of conservative groups is high enough to really start affecting the studios and their bottom line. There's a number of conservative groups and moral crusading groups that thought movies were corrupting the morals of America, especially the youth. Um, and some of this is coming from the fact that by kind of 34, by the mid 30s, you're getting some pushback against the loosening of morals that happens in the 1920s during these Great Depression years. I mean, long periods of economic devastation often sort of push people to swing back to a more conservative or traditional set of values, to kind of look to the past for stability. And so you do get kind of, by 1934, you're kind of getting a pushback against the Roaring Twenties and the sort of loosening of sort of standards of morality, especially morals when it comes to kind of sex and gender relations. Another thing to remember is that prior to the enforcement of the production code, starting in the teens, but definitely in the 20s and early 30s, there's dozens of local censorship boards. So this is at the state level or the city level across the country, who are able to censor movies within their jurisdiction. The state of Kansas actually has a long-standing censorship board, the state of Ohio, the city of New York. So there's all of these major outlets that actually have their own local censorship of films. And what these local censorship boards could do is outright ban a movie, or more often than not, they would make cuts to a movie. So they would cut out a scene that they thought offensive if it was too violent, if it showed too much skin. The Kansas Censorship Board was especially concerned about images of women smoking. They would often cut those out. But typically, it's kind of the racier images of sex and violence and the use of profanity that you're seeing all of the time in these pre-code, or to a much higher rate than you did before, in these pre-code movies. And so think about this creatively. If you're a studio who makes, or a director, who makes a film, and across the country, dozens of different versions are being shown with different portions being cut out depending on the proclivities of those local censors, you know, that you've lost creative control over your product. And so studios wanted a consistent creative product without multiple versions. And often a lot of these cuts were very uncreative and made movies terrible to watch. So there is this desire to sort of to maybe give in to the call for censorship just so you can have this unified product nationwide. There's also a strong desire by studios to avoid regulation by the federal government. There's a famous Supreme Court case, one of the first Supreme Court cases that has to do with motion pictures, in 1915, called Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. And in it, the Supreme Court ruled that films are not protected by First Amendment rights to free speech and therefore could be censored. So the U.S. Hollywood film industry was always worried about federal government censorship. And there had been kind of new, quote, scholarly work that had come out in the early 30s that purportedly showed the dangers of watching sex and violence on the psychology of youth and young adults. And I mean, obviously, these are debates that go on throughout the 20th and 21st century, but there's now kind of this scholarly veneer to some of these moral arguments against movies. And so the studios are really afraid by July of 1934 that the federal government is going to enact legislation that censors or regulates films, and they don't want this. They want to regulate themselves. So if somebody's going to regulate them, they want to do it themselves. So in July of 1934, studios start enforcing the production code, which means that every major studio has to submit a script to the production code board. The actual sort of analysis of scripts is overseen by a man named Joseph Breen, who was also himself a devout Catholic. A lot of people involved in the production code were sort of involved with Catholic organizations that had been crusading against the movies. It's kind of strange that sometimes instead of the production code, we call it the Hays Code, because Hays was kind of technically the head of the office, but Breen is the censor. So studios have to submit scripts for review. Then Breen and other censors could suggest changes, could suggest things that should be cut out. And then it would go back to the studio and they'd make changes and they'd say, well, let's do this instead. And so there'd be a lot of back and forth. I mean, there's all of these great stories. I think actress and producer and script writer, she wrote and produced all her own stuff, Mae West, who will watch a Mae West movie in this class. But she basically said she'd put really outrageous stuff in there in her scripts so that the censors would focus on those and then let what the sort of innuendos that she actually wanted in, they would let those slip because they'd be focusing on the really overt stuff. And there's lots of stories about writers doing similar things, that you kind of pad up the scripts with lots of stuff that you knew the censors wouldn't like, just so the more sort of non-obvious stuff would get through, right? And this was the system until the late 60s. This is the system. It's also really hard to get a movie made and in front of people's screens if you're outside of the studio system. So remember, this is voluntary. So, the question is, well, why didn't people just make films outside, with an independent studio outside of these 5 or 6 major studios who agreed to this process of the production code office reviewing their script? Well, you have to think about, the power that these studios had. I mean, studios controlled all, the production of a movie, the writing of the script, the filming of it, the casting of actors, the choosing of the director. They also oversee, to the large extent, distribution. And in many cases, major Hollywood studios either outright owned or had specific relationships with theater chains across the country. So if your movie wasn't backed by a major studio, hardly anyone is ever going to get a chance to see it. And this is really important. So what did the code actually do? So the code was founded according to the concept, quote, if motion pictures present stories that will affect lives for the better, they can become the most powerful force for the improvement of mankind. And, that's kind of a lofty goal. And the implication being that films are sort of failing at this goal, right? That they're not improving mankind or bettering mankind. So the code was based on 3 general principles. No picture shall be produced that will, quote, lower the moral standards of those who see it. So the sympathy of the audience should never be shown to, or should never be thrown on the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. So if people engage in criminal activity, then they should pay for it, or they should realize their wrongdoing. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. And third, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. And so that isn't just human law. By natural law, that really was implying certain standards of sexual mores. So this sort of outlaws kind of overt depictions of same-sex desire. This actually, in a lot of ways, for a long time, censored depictions of interracial relationships along the idea of violations of, quote, natural law. So basically, you can't show extreme forms of sort of violence, sex, sexuality, but you also can't have characters that are morally corrupt and are seen as favorable by the audience, right? So these 3 rules were developed in a series of, the rules were sort of further grouped into a series of sort of self-explanatory headings like crimes against the law, sex, vulgarity, obscenity, profanity, costumes, dances or suggestive movements, religions, locations, so you can't really show in the bedroom in a specific way, national feelings, titles, and repellent subjects, i.e. extremely graphic violence. So there's a lot of sort of prohibitions about what you can and can't show, and studios agreed to this because of all the reasons we talked about. So you actually get the eventual breakdown of the code for a number of reasons. First, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled on a case that broke up studios owning theater chains based on the fact that they saw this as a violation of monopoly law. So you get a little bit of opening in terms of theaters not being beholden to have to show the movies of the studio that they're associated with, right? So maybe you get a little movement for independent films. In 1952, this is a big one. The Supreme Court reverses the Mutual decision. So the decision that said that films don't have First Amendment freedom of speech protection, the Supreme Court reverses that in 1952. So films are now technically protected from censorship by the First Amendment, which means that Hollywood doesn't have anything to fear in terms of federal government regulation. In 1953, the independent studio United Artists released Otto Preminger's movie The Moon is Blue without production code approval. So it did not go through that process at all of the approval of the script and the back and forth of the production code. And this is they're kind of the first, it wasn't like a huge hit, but it's the first movie that, actually gets a relatively wide distribution that circumvents the production code. And by the late 19, there's a lot of films then in the late 50s and 60s that are kind of skirting the production code, independent movies that are trying to get made. So by the late 1960s, the production code is dead. And it gets replaced by what we have now, which is the movie rating system, which is another system of Hollywood regulating itself. However, with the movie rating system, you can basically show any content that you want. There's just limitations on who can actually go into the movie and see it, right? So an R-rated movie, if you're under 17, you have to be accompanied by a parent or guardian. So why all the interest in pre-code films now? Well, pre-code films are actually kind of rediscovered in the late 50s and 60s with sort of the spread of television. And as TV channels are looking for content, especially late night content, and they don't want to put new content on at late night, they start showing old movies. Now, they're heavily edited on TV in the 50s and 60s, but people start sort of rediscovering older movies. Of course, today, with access to unedited versions and restored copies, we can appreciate these films even more fully. So running the gamut of playful and suggestive to lurid and exploitative pre-code movies give us a window into the changing cultural mores of America in the early 1930s, and I would argue they're kind of just plain fun to watch.